Welcome to the short format of Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. This episode we talk to Clark Banack regarding the article Ethnography and Political Opinion, Identity, Alienation, and Anti-establishmentarianism in Rural Alberta. For more in-depth conversation with Banack, you can access our long format podcast on the same Spotify, Apple Podcast, or YouTube feed.
So my name is Clark Banack, and I'm the director of the Alberta Centre for Sustainable Rural Communities at the University of Alberta, which is a research centre focused on all manner of topics pertinent to the resiliency of rural communities. So this means much of my recent work has been kind of rural focused. So, and that's where this project grew out of. We have another project. I have another co-edited book coming out called Building Inclusive Communities in Rural Canada. But more broadly, as a political scientist, I've long been interested in populism and conservatism in Canada and Alberta in particular, but also religion and politics. So, my first book that came out in 2016 was kind of an attempt to explore the ways in which religion has influenced Alberta politics going back for about a century. And I actually have another new book with Jim Farney that will be out shortly on the politics of religious education in Canada. My central interest in the paper that we're talking about today was really just trying to better understand the political opinions held by rural Albertans in a way that went a bit deeper than survey work. But it was also about trying to replicate a methodology that I'd only recently come across in the American context, but had not really encountered in Canadian political science yet. So in terms of a research question, in this type of ethnography, which I'll explain in a second, I wasn't really setting out to test a specific hypothesis. It was more about what can I learn about rural public opinion by listening to groups of rural people talk about politics. And, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't anticipating finding some form or level of political discontent in these conversations. But I wanted to learn more about it, how people were making sense of it in their own minds and how it influenced how they made sense of other political issues. So in terms of methodology, I used what has been labeled a political ethnographic design, which in short is meant to allow for the immersion of the researcher into the world of the subjects. Now, there are more or less intense ways to do this. Obviously, anthropologists have been deeply embedding themselves, for some time into particular cultures or communities. For me, it was much less intense form of embedding. It was really as simple as me, saddling up to groups of people who were sitting in coffee shops or restaurants or sporting events in rural communities and introducing myself and asking them if I could sit down and become a participant in their conversation. And it was, I would ask them from time to time kind of a general question that would direct them kind of towards politics in a very broad sense. But mostly I was just there listening to them talk about politics. And the data that I used for this study was simply, these conversations that were either transcribed if I was given permission to record them, or, I took very detailed notes if they weren't comfortable with the conversations being recorded. But, that's where the data came from for this study. In terms of findings, I certainly did find widespread forms of political discontent across groups of rural Alberta citizens, but it was often related not so much to their personal circumstances, but rather to the social groups they felt most attached to. So, for instance, the types of alienation I encountered tended to be related to the perceived mistreatment of a particular group or groups they felt strongly attached to. So, for instance, there was a lot of, what we would traditionally call Western or Alberta-specific alienation that came out of these conversations, the sense that Alberta has been chronically mistreated by Ottawa or the federal government. And, this was all rather unsurprising to me. I was expecting this. There was also a strong sense that as ordinary people And the folks I talked to very much saw themselves as ordinary people. They would use that language quite frequently, that we're just ordinary people. And they had the sense that as ordinary people, politicians and the political system in general was not serving them well, was not responsive to their needs or concerns. And then finally, there was a strong sense that as rural citizens, they were often ignored or even looked down upon by urban citizens and urban politicians. But again, these types of concerns were widely held across the groups that I met with, despite the fact that many of the individuals that made up these groups were not personally struggling financially, right? So this wasn't about a group of unemployed people casting blame related to their own personal plight. Rather, it was often comfortably secure folks who were strongly attached to these particular identities as either as an Albertan or as an ordinary person or as rural, and convinced that these particular groups were under attack in some way. And so that was, I would say, kind of the most concrete finding. And I do, in the last section of the paper, I do take some time to show how, this layered sense of alienation related to these particular social identities did play into how these folks were, embracing a certain type of anti-establishment politics, but also how it tended to influence at least some of these folks' interpretations around the plight of newcomers or the plight of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So that makes up, a good chunk of the paper as well. Can we use this work to prevent or contain mass political dissatisfaction? That containing mass political dissatisfaction is a pretty tall order. And I'm certainly not under the impression that, just a few more political scientists sitting at tables listening to people talk is all that's required to kind of overcome this growth of, resentment-based populism that we've been seeing. But I would say that, when facing a growing level of political or even cultural resentment amongst, a certain segment of the population, I never think it's a bad idea to be working to better understand their thinking, even if, ultimately you're never actually going to agree with what they're thinking. I think at least trying to understand their perspective is important. And I think there are ways to use this type of understanding to, better tailor a response to the grievances that people are feeling that are, fueling this resentment-based populism.
Thank you for listening to Insights, a CJPS podcast. For the long format of this episode, visit us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP, or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube to keep up to date with our monthly podcasts. Thank you for listening.